everyone.
Hi.
So I want to start by telling a story that's in a book it's a classic book on the Sabbath by Wayne Mueller. And in the story, he tells about a South American tribe that would go on a long march, day after day. And then all of a sudden, they would stop walking, set up camp, and just make camp for a couple days and not go any further. And they were asked about this, and they said they needed time of rest so that their souls could catch up with them. As New Yorkers, it's really easy to get caught up in the craziness of life, forget about trying to get ahead, like we're just trying to keep up with everybody else, right? What can we learn from this South American tribe? Are we willing to take time for our souls to catch up with us? And really, what does that look like in our lives? That's what I want to delve into tonight as we look at spiritual formation through Sabbath. So let's take some time to pray and then dive into this topic. God, I thank you for creating the Sabbath. God, for recognizing the need for rest. And God, I just pray that you would come tonight in this time, in this space, and that you would really teach us what this looks like in our life and what you're calling us into in Sabbath. So come, Holy Spirit, come speak to us tonight. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So tonight we're going to start by really just looking at why Sabbath is important, then delve into really what is Sabbath, and then I'm going to end with really an invitation for Sabbath for all of us. So, let me see. Nope, wrong way. There we go. So, why are we looking at Sabbath? Why are we even talking about this? Last week, we started off by doing a group Lectio Divina, where as a church, we really delved into this passage from Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 5:12 to 14. And this passage is actually taken from the list of the Ten Commandments that Moses goes through in the book of Deuteronomy. I'm not going to read through it tonight. I know we delved in it last time, but it really looks at that God has called us to keep the Sabbath day holy. It's actually one of the Ten Commandments. It's the fourth commandment. It's up there before do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, right? Why is it that we don't need any reminders in our life? Like, oh yeah, do not commit adultery. That's still relevant in our life today. Do not murder. That's still relevant. But somehow Sabbath sort of seems to slip away. I actually grew up as part of a culture that deeply respected the Sabbath. So I grew up on a farm, and of course there were farm chores that had to be done because animals needed to be kept alive, you needed to milk every day. But beyond that, my family, my dad, who was the farmer, was pretty, they didn't do anything beyond what absolutely needed to get done. You didn't do field work, you didn't do anything else. And that actually is a pretty big commitment for a farmer, especially around planting time and harvest time, because you're so dependent on the weather. There's only specific times you can get out in the field. And I never saw my dad or anybody else go out in the fields. They would stay up late before or after, but Sunday was that time. And not only that, like nobody in our community did. Like you would never see a tractor in the field or a horse, because there was actually Amish in that community too, but you would never see them out either. And I remember this as a positive thing growing up. I remember Sundays as being a positive thing, and I never questioned it. However, looking back, I find that when I left that community after college, along with some other things that I kind of labeled as legalistic, like no TV, no jewelry, which was other things that was also I grew up with, I realized that I sort of tossed Sabbath out with that for a while. Because isn't there a part of us that kind of asks, is Sabbath still relevant for today? Is that being legalistic, right? And I think that's the question that I asked when I was leaving that community. And a reason I think that we ask that is because we live in a society that values productivity above everything else. Think about it. Like when you ask someone how they're doing, how often do you hear, oh my gosh, I'm so busy, right? And often we wear that sort of like a badge of honor. But is it a good thing? I actually saw a quote this past week that said, stop glorifying busy. In a sense, isn't that what we're doing? But often, if you're like me, it can make us feel important, right? We're doing something and that becomes part of our identity. It makes us feel valuable because we're involved in a lot of things. And I think the danger of this mindset is that it keeps us enslaved to the need to prove ourselves and to the have-tos of this life. I think what was significant last week in this passage of Deuteronomy, as we dug into it in the Lectio Divina, the part of this passage that really stood out is that the reason that God commands us to keep the Sabbath, he tells us to remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Because we actually have a God who's rescued us from the have-tos of life, right? He's rescued us from slavery. He's rescued us from the need to constantly have to work, to constantly have to prove ourselves. Thomas Merton is a Trappist monk who dedicated his life to contemplation and prayer. And he actually passed away in 1968. But he has this quote, and I think it's interesting that he said this before 1968, because I think it's much more relevant in our world today. And I have it up here. And he says, there's a pervasive form of contemporary violence, and that is activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything, is to succumb to violence. The frenzy of our activism neutralizes our work for peace. It destroys our own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitful needs of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. I want to read that last sentence again because I think it's really powerful. It destroys the fruitful needs of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. Tilden Edwards, in his book Sabbath Time, states that our society has created this deadly rhythm between driven achievement and narrow escape time. And he shows it like this. And at the heart of this rhythm is anxiety and a push to continually do. And we're acting out of the assumption that it's up to us to make things happen, right? Work is demanded, rest is deserved. And as a result, we push ourselves to exhaustion. Isn't this a form of slavery? And I'm going to be honest, I think most of us have experienced this, and I know I have experienced this in my own life, right? We push ourselves in work, and we go and we go and we go until all of a sudden we're so exhausted that we can't do anything except numb ourselves out. And maybe that's through binge watching Netflix, maybe that's through food, maybe that's through alcohol. It can be any number of things, and none of those things are wrong in and of themselves. But when it's part of this cycle of mind numbing, I think it comes out of this anxiety, right? It comes out of this vicious cycle of ungrace. The way our society views productivity and drivenness is detrimental. I would say not only to our health, but I would argue that what we're producing is usually coming out of this need to prove ourselves to the world. But I would also say that along with anxiety and ungrace, another thing that can kind of be in the middle of this is fear, right? So Pete Scazzaro, I think he's a name probably common to a lot of people in this room. He was a pastor out at New Life Fellowship and has since become a leader in kind of emotional health in the Christian world, emotional healthy leaders, emotionally healthy churches, etc. And so as part of his work in emotional health, he's really put an emphasis on the need for Sabbath, right? And so he's worked with a lot of pastors, and he would continually tell them the importance of Sabbath, and they'd be like, yeah. But then he would ask them, are you doing it? And he'd be like, no, right? And so he was talking with a counselor friend of his and just expressing this like frustration that he was having of like, they know what to do, why are they not doing it? And his friend reflected back to him, he's like, they're not practicing the Sabbath because they're terrified. They're terrified at what they will see in themselves if they stop. So who are we if we're not producing? Are we brave enough to face that question? I have another quote from Wayne Mueller in his book on Sabbath, where he says, because of our desire to succeed and to meet these ever-growing expectations, we do not rest. Because we do not rest, we lose our way. We miss the compass points that would show us where to go. We bypass the nourishment that would give us succor. We miss the quiet that would give us wisdom. We miss the joy and love born of endless delight. Poisoned by this hypnotic belief that good things can come only through unceasing determination and tireless effort, we never truly rest. And for want of rest, our lives are in danger. And that last sentence is pretty big, right? Our lives are in danger. But I would actually say that I don't think it's an exaggeration, especially if you look at society today, right? And often if we are not taking times to rest, our body will eventually force us to, right? Through sickness or some other reason, because it's a need. So knowing this, I want to look at then what is Sabbath and how is it different? What I've come to learn since those days of leaving that community, leaving Sabbath, and then reintroducing it into my own life is that incorporating a rhythm and Sabbath into our lives instead of being legalistic, it actually brings freedom. Adam Fowling wrote a book called The Unhurried Life, and he wrote it looking at the life of Jesus, right? If you look at Jesus, he really did not hurry anywhere. And he says, God never meant Sabbath to be an enslaving you can't day as much as a freeing you don't have to day. We act as though we have no freedom to choose to make regular space for rest in our life and work. So I would like to propose that our work is actually more powerful when it's marked by a cadence of Sabbath rest. Wayne Mueller, in his book, he interviewed and talked to a lot of people kind of about the idea of rest. And one person he talked to is this guy named Oscar Castro-Neves, who's an accomplished guitarist and composer. Does that name ring a bell for anybody? I don't know who he is, but I didn't know if anybody else would. He actually wrote lots of scores from movies.
Oh, yeah.
You do? You know who he is?
Castro-Neves?
Oh, yes. Castro-Neves, yeah. Probably the same person. But he he uses music to explain. He says it's common in a dramatic scene to gradually bring the music to a crescendo and then stop, rest, silence. Whatever is spoken on the screen in that silence is heard more clearly, more powerfully, and the works are lent an additional potency because they're spoken out of the silence. When you listen to music, he counsels me, listen to the cadence of rest. And then he also says in speeches, people can really use this. So he gives the example of Martin Luther King's famous speech. And he says, listen to the cadence, like free at last, rest. Free at last, rest. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last, right? So even this idea of rest and the power that it can bring is built into, even more than our lives, into the music. So why is this? Why does a time of rest make things more powerful? And a lot of it goes back to the fact that our creation story is built upon this cadence of rest. If we look back at Genesis 2, verses 2 to 3, it says, by the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all of the work of creating that he had done. So I would say the rhythm of work and rest is built into the cadence of how we were created. It's built into the cadence of how our world was created and the need that it was created into. In Hebrews, the New Testament book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verses 9 to 11, it says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. And here when he's talking about he's actually referring to the people of Israel, the Israelites. So it's the people that Moses was speaking to in the book of Deuteronomy, that he was actually giving the Ten Commandments to. The people that God rescued out of slavery, right? So God rescued them. He took them out into the wilderness to teach them his law. And then he gave them the promised land, the promise of this promised land that he was offering them. And the book of Hebrews is kind of comparing that promised land to a rest for his people, a rest from the slavery. But if we've read these stories, we see that time and time again, when the Israelites are wandering through the desert, they're constantly questioning God and they're disbelieving. And when it actually finally comes time to enter the promised land, they're like, God, I don't actually, like, the people, there's giants in that land, we're not going to be able to defeat them, right? And so it's from this constant disbelief that they can't enter the promised land, right? It's this constant lack of faith. And so the author of Hebrews is saying, I'm calling you to faith, to believe that there's a Sabbath rest for you. Don't be like those people, those Israelites who are wandering around not believing in God, right? You have to believe in God. And this idea of entering into rest, it takes faith, right? Because we're actually never going to be done with all of our work. And are we going to have faith that God is bigger than this work, right? Bigger than everything we have to accomplish, and to let go of that and actually enter in. So a rhythm of Sabbath is a rhythm of faith. If God can rest from his work, who are we to say that we're more important and we don't have time to rest? So Edward Tilton gives us a new way, a new cycle, a new way of looking at a rhythm of work and rest centered on faith. And it looks like this. It's a cycle built on trust, a life-giving cycle of grace. When we incorporate Sabbath into our lives, it is a power to change the rhythm of how we work. Instead of our identity being shaped by our work, our identity is shaped in our Sabbath rest and then expressed through our work. It's a rhythm where work is given rest is given. What we do comes out of this Sabbath time. Look, we're New Yorkers. There's so much going on in our lives. Our work is never really going to be finished. If we're waiting for our work to finish, we're never going to rest. Rest depends on grace and trust. And actually, I would say in my own life, as I've reintroduced Sabbath, I find that often the day after I've rested, the work that it produces seems to be a lot easier and to flow a lot more quickly, which is interesting. Another story that Wayne Mueller tells is of speaking to some quantum physicists. I don't know if you have any physicists in the room. He was speaking with Hans Peter Dürr, who worked with the Nobel Prize winner Werner Heisenberg. Anybody know these people? That's right, I don't either. But he discovered the uncertainty principle in quantum physics. So this is a pretty smart guy, right? So Hans Peter would describe having long impassioned discussions with Heisenberg when working on a problem, and they would look at it from every angle, and then suddenly Heisenberg would say, wait, I think we've touched on something very important here. Let's not talk about it anymore. Let's wait for 2 weeks and let it solve itself. And then when we got together 2 weeks later, it would invariably be solved. We would begin talking, and we would both know that we had the answer. How much more powerful would our lives and work be shaped out of this Sabbath rest? So tonight, I want to extend to us an invitation to Sabbath rest. That all of the 168 hours of our week would be marked by the cadence of Sabbath. That the work that God is calling us to, these other, like the evangelism, the discipleship, all of this work that God's calling us to would be birthed out of this time of rest and time sitting at his feet. I really see Sabbath as an invitation for a taste of the eternal rest that God has planned for his children. And it's not about legalism, but it's about freedom, caring for our soul, and the fruit of the Spirit that can really grow over time. And as I've been reading about Sabbath, I've actually been amazed at stories from authors and people that I really respect their work. And it's actually more powerful seeing that they have regularly practiced Sabbath in their lives. And one of these is the author Wendell Berry. Is anybody familiar with Wendell Berry? Okay, we have one person. He's an amazing author. Actually, if you like fiction, or he has written some amazing books that are really powerful. And he actually tells the story of his experience in nature in Sabbath. And this is in the introduction to a book that he has written called Sabbath Poems, which are actually poems that he wrote out of these Sabbath times in nature. And he said, in such places, on the best of these Sabbath days, I experience a lovely freedom from expectations, other people's and also my own. I go free from tasks and intentions of my work days, and so my mind becomes hospitable to unintended thoughts, to what I am very willing to call inspiration. And I think, actually, I thought it was kind of beautiful that what came out of actually this Sabbath time was something that we would say would be productive, like a book of poems. But it reminded me of our passage, the other passage that we looked at last week from Leviticus, where it talks about actually giving the time to rest, the land a time to rest. But as the land rested, there was still fruit that was produced, right? Because the land cannot not produce fruit or grains. And so that was something for the people to eat. But that there's actually stuff that can be birthed out of this Sabbath time that can be really fruitful. So how do we Sabbath? I'm inviting us into this, but how do we do this? how do we take this time? And what I've actually found is taking real rest takes work. As funny as that sounds, but it takes planning, it takes intentionality in the front end to really take real rest. And I'm also going to say, and when I dive into this, you'll see why, I think Sabbath looks different for different people. So there's no like real rules, I would say, for Sabbath, but there's characteristics that I think we can really think about as we think how we want Sabbath to look in our lives. And I take these characteristics again from Pete Scazzaro, who really dived into emotional health. And he did extensive research on Sabbath through the scriptures, and he found there's 4 characteristics. And they are, oh, this is the Wendell-Berry quote, sorry. I read it to you, but it's up here too. They are to stop work, enjoy rest, practice delight, and contemplate God. So the first one is to stop work. And I would encourage us to really look at a 24-hour period of our week to stop work. And if this is something you're just introducing to your life, feel like you can start this slowly, right? Like you might not have to start with a 24-hour, start with a half a day. Start with what you can, but I would encourage you to work yourself up to a 24-hour period of time to stop all paid and unpaid work. And this takes planning. It takes time, right? It means that we take time to do our chores other times during the week. And it could be different times for different people, right? So it's looking at your schedule and when does it work for you. And a lot of times people will actually do it from like 6 p.m. on one day to 6 p.m. the other day. And this could be like 6 p.m. on Saturday to 6 p.m. on Sunday, because they find that they actually do need that time on Sunday evening to get ready for the week or to like touch base on some emails or something before going in, right? So it's like looking at your schedule, what works for you. And then maybe it's letting people know too, right? So maybe it's actually, and this can be hard for New Yorkers, but it's maybe actually letting people at work know, hey, I'm not gonna be able to get to your email probably until like 6 or 7 on a Sunday night from Saturday, but I will answer you, but there's like this time where I'm actually away from it. It's prepping people for that. The second thing that you do on Sabbath is to enjoy rest. And I want to read Psalm 23, verses 2 to 3, because I think it shows a beautiful picture of rest. It says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." And I think this also takes some thought for each of us. What is actually restful for us? What brings us rest? And I would say real rest usually includes activities that bring us closer to God and others. And I think, this is going to look different for different people. There's actually a rabbi, Abraham Heischel, who has also written extensively. You know him? Thank you. He's written extensively on the Sabbath. And something he said I found interesting is that the man who or the person, I'm not going to say man, the person who works with his mind should Sabbath with his hands. The person who works with his hands should Sabbath with his mind. And I was actually saying that to a coworker today, and he was like, "That's really interesting because I find mowing the lawn really restful." But it makes sense, right? It's actually doing something, whereas for somebody else, mowing the lawn is going to be work, right? And so it's thinking through what's actually restful for you. I actually really sometimes enjoy trying out a new recipe and cooking on Sabbath, right? But for somebody else, that could feel like a lot of work, and that would seem like the last thing they want to do. Yeah. All right, I'm seeing, like, that sounds horrible for some people, right? And so this is gonna look different, and like my Sabbath will look very different from someone like John Kim, right? Because we just have very different interests or things that would bring rest for us. So think about this for you. And then also when you're thinking about rest, you might want to think about like people and places that are restful for you. I know there's one pastor friend in the city who says on his Sabbath, he really only spends time with his like wife and children. He's like, because that's kind of what's really restful for me, right? But think about, it doesn't have to be that, but think about people that are restful for you, that you want to spend time with on your Sabbath. And then I also want to say, like, in different periods of your life, your Sabbath, the way it looks may change too, and that's okay. And for me, it even changes a little bit week for week, because sometimes there's some weeks I just want a completely unscheduled day where I don't have to do anything. But other weeks, it actually feels more restful for me to have like a plan where I meet someone for like a movie and dinner, and then I have part of it on schedule, right? And so I think it just really, it differs, and that's okay. It's thinking through what you need. And then I think another part about rest, I want to encourage you to think about how electronics play into this, maybe social media, turning off email. Is this stuff really bringing rest in your life, right? Is this something that you need in your Sabbath, or is that something that we could turn off for 24 hours? The third thing is to practice delight. And so along with what gives you rest, what like brings you delight? For me, something that I really enjoy is spending time in nature. Like I love nature and parks. So I often will prioritize like a walk in a park, exploring different parks. I tend to go, like I like to do that by myself a lot of times and just have this like, just this rambling walk. If it's nice, I might take a book or catch up with family by phone, something like that that's there. For some people, it could be a sports game, trying a new restaurant if you really like food. But what actually brings you delight? And then a lot of times people like to create rituals around Sabbath as well, if that's helpful. A lot of times families or different people will light a candle to kind of mark the beginning of the Sabbath, just something to kind of mark it, make it special, that this is a 24 hours set apart. I want to tell a story of how Eugene Peterson spent his Sabbath. Do people know who Eugene Peterson is? He's also an author that I really respect, and he has done like this multitude of work, including translating the scripture from its original language to like modern day language. Like that's like, okay, which of us could do that? Like that's incredible. As well as pastoring a church and writing a number of other books as well. But he really kept to a rhythm of Sabbath. And it says when he served as a pastor, he took his Sabbath on a Monday, because obviously he couldn't on a Sunday. And he and his wife would pack a lunch and drive to a trailhead. Before starting the hike, they would read a psalm and then pray. And then they would hike in silence for several hours at a leisurely pace, taking in the nature around them. And when it was time for lunch, they broke the silence with a prayer for the food, and then shared their observations, thoughts, and feelings from the morning. And I love how this really kind of combines the last two here, practicing delight, which was spending time in nature, as well as using the time to really contemplate God, right? So it's setting, God set apart the Sabbath day as holy, right? How can we also mark it as holy? And I think this means being purposeful and remembering that the delights are evidence of God's love. And it may mean setting specific time for prayer, but I would say overall is being mindful throughout the day of God's presence and being with you in that. And so again, it's thinking of what are activities that are drawing you closer to God and to others. So it's maybe, a lot of times during our week, it's hard to have extended times of prayer. A lot of times in like the morning or as I start, I'd like to like read a spiritual formation book and actually take a more extended time of prayer that I wouldn't have time for other times of the week. But I think it's important to actually take time in our own lives to think, how can we incorporate this into our Sabbath? These characteristics. And it's going to look different. Stop work, enjoy rest, practice delight, contemplate God. And I want to leave us with this beautiful quote, again from Wayne Mueller, where he says, Sabbath is a way of being in time where we remember who we are, remember what we know, and taste the gifts of spirit and eternity. Like a path through a forest, Sabbath creates a marker for ourselves. So if we are lost, we can find our way back to our Creator. Remember the Sabbath means remember that everything you have received is a blessing. Remember to delight in your life, in the fruits of your labor. Remember to stop and offer thanks for the wonder of it. 166. What would it look like for us to be a church marked by the rhythms of grace and trust, where our work, our evangelism, our discipleship flow out of the Sabbath time of rest, where we are acknowledging that the work God is calling us to is not possible to do on our own. It is only possible in God's strength. In our humanness, it's so easy to forget this truth and fall back into striving and anxiety. A weekly Sabbath is a resistance against that, right? It's a marker. It's a way back to our center, a way to truth, trust, and grace. How is God inviting you to Sabbath in your own life? Kara asked us to reflect on this question last week in our Lectio Divina. And I feel like God is calling us to go even deeper into this question. So I want to just give us a minute of silence to reflect on this in your own life. How is God calling you, inviting you